All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the book of Leviticus. In the last recording, we gave a little bit of kind of introduction and backstory to the book, and as promised there, this recording, we want to focus on two topics that go together that are related in the book of Leviticus, two topics that you have to understand if you're going to read Leviticus well. And those two topics are ritual purity and impurity, the whole idea of ritual states, and then related to that, atonement. So we're going to talk mostly about ritual purity and impurity, and then we'll end this recording by talking about what atonement means and why it's so important in the book of Leviticus at the end of this recording. So let's begin by talking about ritual purity and impurity. This is one of the things that makes Leviticus feel so foreign, unfamiliar, and even at times weird to us. But what we need to recognize is that every culture, even our own culture, whatever culture you currently live in, has its own social taboos, things you just don't do because it feels inappropriate or feels unclean. It'd be like, no, that's gross, right? Like, don't eat a meal in the bathroom. That's gross, right? We just don't do that. And every culture has all sorts of social taboos. Not only that, many traditional cultures, even today, have codes of ritual purity. So in a lot of Western European type cultures or my culture in the United States of America, the whole idea of ritual purity just feels completely foreign. But there are traditional cultures, say in Africa, that still have codes of ritual purity, like ritual taboos, social taboos that are related to the spiritual world and to the divine. Well, the same was true in the ancient Near East. That's the world of Israel and the Exodus. So what it seems like is God used this idea of codes of ritual purity that was common and hardwired into ancient Israel because of the cultural air they breathed. God used this as a teaching tool and as a way to mark Israel out as distinct from the nations around her. So in the ancient Near East, ritual impurity involved a status rendering a person temporarily unfit to enter sacred spaces like tabernacles or temples, and temporarily unfit to interact with the divine. Think of it like a proper protocol for entering the sanctuary and for approaching the holy. There's just things you don't do when approaching the holy, right? They even had this idea with regard to kings. You don't just barge into a king's throne room, into the palace. There's a proper protocol for coming before a king. And the same is true with the divine. That's what ritual impurity or ritual purity deals with. So, in a nutshell, here is the basic idea of ritual purity laws. Ritual purity was a divinely prescribed prerequisite for approaching the tabernacle and handling sacred food. That's what it is. So while the rules concerning ritual impurity and purity and all of that seem so foreign to us, because to most of us they are, to the ancient Israelites, it was all very normal. An ancient Israelite might actually say to us, if we're like, man, that book of Leviticus was so weird, they would be like, why is that? Well, of course God gave us rules concerning ritual purity. It was actually very gracious of him. Otherwise, we wouldn't know what to do in order to approach him in a way that honored him and his sacred space. So for them, it made perfect sense. Now, before looking at exactly some aspects of ritual purity and ritual states, I think it's helpful for us to think about why God gave instructions on it. Meaning, why would God instruct Israel to pay attention to ritual purity? Again, it's so foreign to us that it seems odd that God would even give such requirements. So why did he do it? Well, when it comes to maybe specific instructions about specific issues like skin diseases or menstruation or some of those things. It's not maybe always possible to figure out the specific rationale for a specific instruction. We just have to be honest that the text isn't always clear, so sometimes we're forced to make educated guesses. Some of it could be basic hygiene, that's been a common idea, but others seem more related to like the pagan customs of the nations around Israel. One of the current major theories as to the rationale behind these ritual purity laws in Leviticus has to do with death, or even life and death. That is, ritual purity has to do with states or events that are associated in some way with the whole cycle of life and death. And that's become a very popular theory in the literature on Leviticus. And in some cases, that seems to make sense, like touching a dead body. Clearly, that's associated with death. But some things aren't obviously associated with death. In fact, some seem to be the opposite, like childbirth. You're bringing life into the world. And so some have broadened out the idea from death to this whole cycle of mortality and life and death and all that. And some of that makes sense. In other cases, it seems a bit forced to make one of those ritual impurity laws fit into the cycle of mortality and life and death. And so it actually seems likely to me that there probably is not, this is really important, I think, is not like one overarching rationale. It's probably several. And in fact, in some cases, Israel didn't even know. It's just like, well, that's just the way things are. You think 60, 70, 80 years ago in my country, you didn't wear hats. Guys didn't wear hats in church. And you might even take your hat off in the presence of somebody where you're trying to be respectful. Why is wearing a hat disrespectful? And why is taking it off respectful? Well, most of the time we didn't really know, right? It's just the way it was. There's not like a clear rationale. And so in the case of the ritual purity instructions to Israel and associated with Israel, there's probably some things that were just like part of the cultural air they breathe. There's like, that's just the way things are. And God used it as part of his teaching tools for the nation of Israel. And so there probably isn't even always one clear overarching rationale. In some cases, maybe it's death, like touching a corpse. In some cases, maybe not, like skin diseases. Is that really a category of death? I don't know. There is a passage in the book of Numbers that connects skin diseases to that, so, maybe not. Blood, well, blood is clearly a reason for ritual impurity, but not all blood, only some kinds of blood. If you skin your knee, you're not ritually unclean, but or if you butcher a goat, you're not ritually unclean and get some of its blood on you. But during the monthly period for a woman, ritually unclean. The blood of childbirth makes a woman unclean. So that kind of blood does, but not all blood. What about sex? Sex between husband and wife makes a person ritually unclean. They have to wash and wait till evening. But sex is normal, and it's not associated with life or death per se. So it's not always clear that there's one overarching rationale. And it's not always clear why a specific action or event makes a person ritually impure. And I think we just need to be humble enough to acknowledge that. We don't exactly know why this thing makes a person unclean. Nevertheless, it does. So what I want to focus on here then is the big question of why, before we look at some details about ritual impurity. Why, with regard to the whole system, why did God give these instructions? And the basic answer to that seems to be this: God is meeting people where they're at. The formal word for this is accommodation. It means that God communicates his values to us in a way we can understand. That is, God sometimes uses concepts and language that's familiar to people to help them make sense of what he wants us to understand and what's important to himself. And ritual states and ritual purity was one way God did that. It was just the way people in the ancient Near East thought about approaching the divine. As I noted above, there are still many traditional cultures today that have codes of ritual purity. So God uses it to help Israel understand some things about himself. Now, he doesn't just co opt those things, those codes of ritual impurity or purity, wholesale, but he uses them to communicate his values, which means there are similarities with ritual purity codes from the ancient Near East, and there are differences between the ritual purity laws we see in other cultures around Israel. For example, here's one of the key differences. In the ancient Near East, there were actually a bunch of gods, not one god, and there were various tiers of gods and goddesses. And a lot of time in the cultures of the ancient Near East, the people were dealing with like the junior deities, not the big deities, but the sub deities. And they weren't always sure what they did wrong to upset the gods. So they would interpret their circumstances or the situation communally or individually to say, man, we must have upset the gods, done something dishonoring, and they weren't sure. So they weren't always clear what they needed to do to make things right. So they went through various rituals, hoping it would make things right with the God and sort things out. But not so in Israel. In Israel, there's one God, not a bunch of gods, and he's the most high God, not a junior God. And he tells Israel very directly, very specifically, and very clearly what they need to do in specific cases to be pure, to return to a state of ritual purity so that they can enter into his tabernacle, his space, and honor him in worship. And so rather than having to try to appease the gods and go through all sorts of rigmarole that was unclear, it was perfectly clear. And that was an act of graciousness from God on his part for the ancient Israelites. Here's something else that stands out as a bit unique in the book of Leviticus that makes Israel's purity laws different from the nations around her. In the book of Leviticus, we don't only get ritual purity, there's also discussions of moral purity. And that stands in contrast to a lot of the pagan religions around them where moral purity wasn't really an issue. It was more just, let's not make the gods angry and let's make sure we honor the gods with our ritual purity. But in Leviticus, you also get instructions about sin and holiness, that is, moral purity. So the whole concept of ritual purity makes sense to ancient Israel in their cultural context, and God uses it to teach Israel about the seriousness of God's holiness and about honoring his holiness. Now, it doesn't make sense to a lot of us, and that's why it feels so strange. Not only that, some of its specific practices that we'll read about when we read through Leviticus, they just seem strange just because they were cultural practices of the day and they're not cultural practices of our time. But once again, God is simply meeting people where they're at, speaking their language, using concepts they would understand, and addressing the behaviors and practices of their day. That's what God is doing in Leviticus. So that provides a little bit of understanding as to why God gave these kind of ritual purity laws to ancient Israel like he did. Now, with that in mind, let's try to understand ritual purity and ritual states a little bit more. Here's just a few key facts. I want to give like 5 aspects or 5 key facts or 5 features of ritual purity that'll help us maybe understand it a little bit more so that when you read Leviticus, you can make a little bit more heads or tails out of this. The first is the distinction between the common and the holy. People, places, things, spaces were either common or holy. Sometimes the word common is translated profane, but that doesn't mean bad. It just means not holy. Holy was any place, item, or person consecrated to God for his service. Common, on the other hand, was just ordinary stuff. Any place, item, or person that was used for ordinary things for ordinary purposes, not consecrated to God for his service. So, a person ordained as a priest wearing consecrated clothing was holy. That is, they were in a ritual state as set apart for divine service. A cup or a bowl consecrated for use in worship was holy. It wasn't just a common cup that you would use at dinner or lunch. And the tabernacle was set apart for God, and thus it was holy space. In fact, as you moved from the courtyard into the first room of the tabernacle, the holy place, and then further into the most holy place, you actually intensified the degrees of holiness of the space. That's why non-priests could only go into the courtyard. Priests were allowed into the first room of the tabernacle, the holy place, but only the high priest could go into the most holy place, and even then, only one day a year, because we're moving up in degrees of consecration, of holiness of the space. So, holy is any item, person, place, thing, right? Anything like that that is dedicated, consecrated for holy use. Common was any person, place, or thing that was ordinary and not consecrated for God's purposes or God's use. That's an important distinction. We'll see that all throughout the book of Leviticus. Second key feature is just this whole language of clean and unclean, or maybe better, pure and impure. I'll use those terms interchangeably, both in the commentary as well as here, but pure and impure. This refers to states that common things can be in. So holy things, they're already consecrated and they're in a separate category themselves in the state of holiness. But common things could either be ritually pure or ritually impure. They could either be clean or unclean. So in the case of the book of Leviticus, if you're an Israelite living in the camp around the tabernacle, you could move in and out of a ritually pure or ritually impure state on a regular basis. It was just part of life. It wasn't sinful. It was normal. There was no forgiveness required for it. In fact, in most cases, all you had to do was wash your hands or wash your clothes and wait till evening. That was the standard procedure for ritual impurity. Wash and wait. Now, in some cases, there were major impurities, and those actually required a purification offering to be given. But forgiveness wasn't pronounced, just cleanness, because again, these aren't states of sinfulness or unsinfulness. It's not a moral state, it's a ritual state. That's why the woman's monthly cycle, menstruation, makes a woman unclean, ritually impure. It's just a ritual state. Here's the thing: having sex between a husband and wife, that made you ritually unclean. You had to wash and wait till evening. Or contracting a skin disease, that made you ritually impure. And you had to wait till the skin disease cleared up and then go through a certain procedure in order to once again be ritually clean or ritually pure. These are just parts of life. There's no guilt in them. There's no shame in them. There was no forgiveness needed. But you did need to go through the proper procedure before you could go to the tabernacle, before you could handle sacred food or eat a sacred meal. There was a proper procedure that you needed to go through that was a way of honoring God and His holiness and not defiling His sacred house, the tabernacle. So it wasn't a moral state, it was a ritual state, but it still was theological. That is, ritual states had to do with drawing near to God at His sacred holy tent. And so ritual states taught Israel about the seriousness of God's holiness and about, therefore, approaching God in a pure state. And because Israel was to make distinctions in all sorts of stuff related to their everyday life, meals, sickness, bodily processes, right? Normal stuff, burying a family member, all these things could affect your ritual state. And because Israel had to make distinctions in all these areas, it helped them learn about how important it is to honor God's holiness and set them apart as God's distinct and holy people. So that's the basic idea of ritual purity and impurity. Now, the third thing then, and we've already mentioned it here, so we'll just draw it out explicitly here in number 3. The third thing is that ritual impurity must not contact the holy. That's the key thing. To be in a ritually impure state means you have to avoid holy things. So, ritual purity and ritual impurity dealt with the category of common. But if you, as a common person, were in a ritually impure state, you cannot defile holy things. So, being aware of your ritual state, purity or impurity, was necessary so that you didn't enter into the tabernacle in an impure state or eat a sacred meal in an impure state, because doing that would violate one of God's commands, would be sinful, and therefore would incur guilt. But being impure by itself wasn't sinful or shameful or something that made you guilty. It was just normal. And God graciously told Israel what they needed to do to be clean again. And again, most of the time, it was simply wash and wait till evening. And then you could enjoy a sacred meal with your family if you wanted to, or you could enter into a Sabbath worship if you wanted to, right? And so ritual impurity must not contact the holy because it will defile the holy. Now, number 4, a fourth key thing about ritual purity in the book of Leviticus is it seems as if ritual purity was meant to teach Israel about moral purity and actually encourage moral purity. Old Testament scholar Christopher Wright puts it like this: ritual cleanness, from the kitchen to the sanctuary, was meant to symbolize God's greater requirement of moral integrity and social justice and covenant loyalty. So it was all a means of teaching Israel about being faithful to Yahweh, faithful to the covenant they had made with Yahweh, and living then in a way of moral integrity in all of their lives. Because both ritual purity and moral purity were connected to drawing near to God. And similar language is used for both of them. In fact, by the time we get to the Old Testament prophets, they use the language of cleansing for moral purity, connecting cleansing from sin with cleansing from ritual purity. And so it seems like at least part of, probably the major part of the purpose of ritual purity was to instruct Israel in the need to be pure and clean when they approach God, especially morally pure and clean and faithful to their covenant with Him. And then finally, number 5, ritual states, ritual purity and impurity, marked a group out as distinct. It said, this is our people. This is how we worship. This is who we are. And so another key effect of the laws of ritual purity was to foster strong social boundaries. And so it marked Israel out as a distinct people. We are the people who serve Yahweh. We worship Yahweh, and we honor His holiness like this. And I think that's why in Mark 7, Jesus emphasizes that moral impurity is the key thing that defiles a person. Fixating on matters of ritual impurity while persisting in a state of moral impurity prioritizes the wrong thing. That seems to be Jesus' point in Mark chapter 7. Ritual purity was like a giant experiential object lesson that was meant to mark Israel out as Yahweh's people and to instruct them and encourage them in moral purity and faithfulness to their covenant with Yahweh. That's the key idea. So, just to summarize, the tabernacle and the people and items associated with it, that is the priests and all the holy implements, those were holy. That is consecrated to the Lord and dedicated to His purposes. Outside of that was common space and common people and items. And those common things could either be ritually clean or ritually unclean. And people moved in and out of those ritual states, being either clean or unclean, frequently. It was just normal. It was natural. It's just part of life. And in Leviticus, God graciously gives instructions for how to deal with ritual impurity, ritual uncleanness. While being ritually unclean wasn't a sin, it wasn't a moral issue, ignoring ritual uncleanness and failing to do what God said to do about it, well, that was a sin. It was breaking God's commands, and God took that very seriously. Now, all of that leads to the next topic that we need to deal with is atonement. And we've got to deal with it here because atonement is closely connected to ritual purity in the book of Leviticus, and it's also closely connected to moral purity in the book of Leviticus. The ultimate solution for both sin and impurity was atonement. Now, not all impurities, ritual impurities, required a sacrifice of atonement, but the major ones did. And regular sacrifices didn't cleanse from all sins, only inadvertent sins. But the Day of Atonement, that we'll talk about in Leviticus 16, it did cleanse from all sins. So all of this whole system of atonement, was God's way of dealing with both major ritual impurities and sin. And God mercifully, in His grace, provided this system of atonement for cleansing people and rescuing people and cleansing the tabernacle from the people's sins and impurities. That's atonement. The Hebrew word for it is kippur. You hear it in the modern term Yom Kippur. That's the modern Hebrew name for the Day of Atonement. And there has been much discussion among scholars as to exactly what quote-unquote atonement or kippur refers to. And the reason for that is this. When you read the book of Leviticus, the sacrifices of atonement are offered for sins, but they're also offered for major ritual impurities that don't incur any guilt or sin, right? So why is it that you offer sacrifice of atonement for ritual impurities? Not all, just the major ones. And that has led to some discussion of, okay, what exactly does atonement mean? There's been three key ideas that have been suggested as being related to the meaning of the word kippur or atonement. The first one seems a little in air, and that's the idea of covering, like covering over. That idea was popular in older discussions of atonement, but it seems to come from a faulty understanding of the Hebrew word kippur. The two other ideas that are clearly associated with the idea of atonement in Leviticus are ransom and cleansing or purification. So with those two ideas, ransom and purification, what does atonement mean? Well, atonement effectively, it seems, in Leviticus has two emphases from the combination of those two ideas. So atonement has to do with a ransom that cleanses or a cleansing that ransoms. So let's talk just briefly about those two ideas. The idea of a ransom refers to not having to pay what is owed. That's the idea of a ransom in the book of Leviticus. You pay a lesser payment, and that lesser payment is accepted by the offended party. That's the idea of ransom in the book of Leviticus. And then the idea of purification is cleansing from defilement, just cleansing you from whatever impurity has defiled you. So atonement refers to a ransom that cleanses or a cleansing that acts as a ransom. That is, it delivers from a penalty. That's the ransom idea. It pays some sort of price or penalty for you, delivers from any kind of penal effect, penalty, and it cleanses from whatever has defiled you. That's atonement. Now, it raises another question. How does ritual impurity need a ransom? Why does major ritual impurity need a ransom from some sort of penalty? Since ritual impurity isn't a sin, why a ransom? That's the idea. And first, we need to recognize again that not all ritual impurities are spoken of in terms of atonement. As I've already noted, most just need a cleansing, washing and waiting, right? That's what most need. But there are major impurities that do need some sort of sacrifice of atonement. Those major impurities are skin diseases, touching a dead body, childbirth, and irregular bodily discharges. And those major impurities do require sacrifices that bring about a cleansing. And the reason for that is because major impurities like this, in their thought world, defile God's sanctuary. Now, again, we may not be able to totally get inside their thought world. We didn't live in their world. This was just the air they breathed. But this is what Leviticus affirms, that somehow major impurities defiled God's holy space, the tabernacle. even though no one went in there. In fact, you see this on the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16. The holy place itself, the most holy place, the inner room where the Ark of the Covenant is, somehow that needs to be cleansed from Israel's defilement, even though nobody went in there all year long. And so in the whole thought world of ritual purity and impurity, ritual impurities have this ability, sort of like a dust that gets stirred up, that somehow dirties God's sacred house, the tabernacle. And so somehow these major impurities clung to the tabernacle like a ritually impure dust, and they required atonement, cleansing. And so since that's the case, it would be wrong and dishonoring to not do what God instructed and make atonement for these major impurities. So, in sacrifices dealing with major ritual impurity, there's no forgiveness pronounced, never, but there is cleansing pronounced. In those cases, the offering of atonement is primarily a purification that ransoms. It ransoms in the sense that if you remain in this ritually impure state and enter into worship, you have violated a command, and there is danger associated with that. In sacrifices of atonement dealing with sin, forgiveness is mentioned. You can see that, for example, with burnt offerings in chapter 1, verse 4 of Leviticus. And you can see it with the sin, or better, purification offerings, right? Forgiveness is mentioned. And so in places where sin is being dealt with, the people are pronounced as forgiven. In places where ritual impurities are being dealt with, the people are mentioned as being cleansed. And so it's a ransom that cleanses, or it's a cleansing that ransoms. That's the idea of atonement in relationship to both sin and ritual impurity. And all of this aims at enabling an Israelite worshiper to be right before God and to draw near to God in worship in such a way that he honored God's holiness. That's the whole goal. So while we may not be able to make sense out of some of the ritual purity rules, we should be content to know that these kinds of rules were normal in their world. They were normal for relating to God, and God, in his grace and mercy, gave very clear instructions to ancient Israel for how to deal with both sins and major impurities and minor impurities so that they could draw near to God with a clear conscience, and God could continue to live among them. And while all of this pertained to God's covenant with ancient Israel, and obviously we're not under that covenant anymore, we're in a new covenant with Messiah Jesus, and so our way of approaching God has changed. What you see in the book of Hebrews, dealing with some of this sacrificial system and the Levitical rituals, what you see in Hebrews is we still, as those in Christ, are supposed to honor God's holiness. We can draw near with a completely clear conscience, but we do so as people cleansed by the sacrifice of Jesus. And therefore, we too want to honor his holiness. We want to come before him recognizing he is the all-holy God. And so all these instructions and all these ritual purity laws that we'll see in Leviticus, they're not part of our covenant with God, but they can be instructive to us about the majesty and holiness of God and how God's holiness deserves our deepest respect. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the Old Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible by the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. Literally every month I get a list of people who have donated through World Family Mission, or I look over the list of people who donate through the Study Hub, and that list is long and huge. Most donors give $5, $10, $15, $20, $25. Some give more than that, and all of that is what makes this ministry possible. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, you can go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page, my page at World Family Mission, registered nonprofit, where you can put in a dollar amount. If you want to make it a recurring monthly donation, there's a little box that says make this monthly. Check that box. And all those funds will come this way so this ministry can continue to grow, reach more people and help more people learn and live the Bible. Thanks a ton for your support.